Good morning. I'm going to talk about WCM to WCS migration, otherwise known as Web Content Management to Web Content Services. In a way of introduction, my name is Richard McKnight. I've been working at Alfresco for about 3.5 years in the consulting division. My experience with Alfresco goes back to 2005, so I've known about the product since version 1. I've had a lot of obviously I've had a lot of engagements, and I've worked with some clients that are looking at, that have WCM, and they're looking at how to get off of it. In addition to working with clients that are struggling with how to get off of the AVM and WCM, I've also worked on a number of migrations. And one of the things that strikes me about this process is it's a full-on migration. So as we approach this topic, we'll talk about it as a migration that it is. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, times are changing. The web today is not the web of 2005. It's not the web that many of us saw burst onto the scene almost a decade and a half ago. Websites are built differently. Content is authored differently. And websites are built by teams that are far-flung. Back in the day, you had a few webmasters. You had people working with HTML. They would assemble the site, assemble all the assets, and push it out. Now, you may have a team that builds the framework for your web property, and then you have authors that they author content. They might not even know where it's going on the site. They author content, and it goes through a workflow and gets pushed out. So the needs of these web teams have changed. A lot of the use cases that we've had for the AVM are no longer the use cases that we have today. And so the AVM is not providing as much advantage to the user as the core repository did. Some of the other things that have happened along the way is that the core repository has gotten the lion's share of the love from our engineers. So all of the enhancements, all the performance improvements, all the feature functionality that's been added has gone into the core repository. And one of the things, as I go through this, I'll kind of refer to the AVM as like the web content management side of the repository, and the core repository as what we've talked about in the past as the DM side, or the document management side. The other thing that has happened is a number of the features that we had in the AVM that were compelling for web content management, or for for publishing things to the web, have been moved into the core repository. And as a result, in Alfresco 4.0, the AVM is being deprecated. Now, being deprecated doesn't mean that it goes away, immediately, but it does mean that it puts notice onto the community that this is not something we're going to pursue, and we've made provisions to have people move over and get the best of the functionality that they need out of the core repository. And just one note as we talk about web content services as opposed to web content management. Web content today is content just like any other content. It's not a second-class citizen of content. It's content that we manage and that we put through workflow, and we do, and then it just happens to get pushed out onto the web. So the web content services allow us to take content that's been managed in our enterprise, make it available to the web, and provide the services that allow us to scale and provide that information on the web, where you might be getting lots of hits and a lot of demand for the content. I guess I just said this slide earlier. And so one of the things that you might ask if you're a client is, do I really have to change? Am I going to have to make this change? Well, today, maybe not. You can go with the status quo. If you're running in 3.x, you will be supported until we release Alfresco 5. So you can do what you're doing today and keep doing it until Alfresco 5 comes out. If you want to, you can continue to use the AVM and upgrade to version 4, which means you'll be supported until Alfresco 6 is released. You'll get some improvements with the AVM in version 4, but you'll still be using the AVM. The other option is to upgrade to Alfresco 4, switch to the core repository, and take advantage of the features that we've added to the core repository that will allow you to use our web content services approach. At the end of the day, you can delay change, but you can't delay it forever. I guess the bottom line in terms of talking about this is to really say, look, you've got to plan now to make that transition. Plan for it, look at it in the context of what you're doing, and make some key hard decisions around how you're going to move and what you're going to do. As we go through this talk, we'll talk about some of the opportunities as you move over and just some things to think about in terms of making that transition, how to plan for it, what some of the technical challenges are going to be. But think of this as a change that will come, but also as something that you can leverage. So just to kind of take a step back, I'd like to go ahead and define web content services. I'm going to talk about what web content services are. I'm going to talk about some of the things around changing what we provide, how we've addressed some of the concerns in terms of what you might lose with the AVM, and then talk about just strategies for moving forward. So our web content services are a set of open services that allow us to deliver content to the web. And we deliver content to the web with a number of different in a number of different ways. We have web applications, portals, social media sites. So a lot of content that we have that makes it to the web in a number of different ways. And we've got 3 different components that build up our web content services. We have an authoring tier that lets you manage the content, put it through workflow, approvals, make sure it's ready for the web, make sure it's accurate. It provides transformations and just everything that you need in the content creation process, making sure that content is right. Then we have a seamless compatible web tier layer that allows you to dynamically deliver content to the web. Now, you might say, well, why can't I just deliver it out of my authoring tier, where I've created the content? Well, that authoring tier is tuned to allow you to do all the work around creating the content and keeping those records. It's set up to control who has access to it, who can do what to it, and make sure that that process is protected. Once you make it available on the web, there's certain things that you want it to do. You're no longer really trying to control who can see it, because in general, once you're pushing it to the web tier, unless it's really more of a protected site, but if it's really web content that's just being made available to everybody, once you push it to the web tier, it's got to be pushed out quickly. So the web tier repository, while it's the same repository functionality that we have on the authoring tier, it's tuned to deliver content to the web. So we turn off things like permissions checking so that those things aren't in the process when you're having requests for content to go to the web. And there's other things that you can do in terms of scaling out. And the nice thing about it is we set this web content tier up to allow different web applications or web frameworks to actually pull that content and make it available. So some of the web tier frameworks that are available, like Drupal, LifeRay, Craft-Derivative, or you have your own custom app. And one of the things I might mention is the ones that I have highlighted. Those are actually some of our partners that are here as sponsors of DevCon here in San Diego. So one of the things that is happening is that between Alfresco and our partner network, we're looking at addressing this and making sure that as we move away from web content management, where we're saying, okay, this is just web content, to really saying we have web content services that allow you to deliver any content out to the web. Alfresco and our ecosystem of partners are looking at that and saying, how do we make sure that customers can actually do this. And then we also have a file system transfer receiver that allows you to push content out to the web that may need to be delivered as static assets. So, so the content that actually goes into the web tier repository, that may be stuff that's dynamic. So you might have to do a query to say, find all the documents that match these criteria, or and things like that. Whereas the static content may be things like icons and CSS files and things like that that are really used just to make the page look pretty, but maybe need to be managed by by people who are managing the content just because of the flexibility. And these three components are connected via transfer services. So if you remember in the old AVM, we had the FSR and the ASR, and you would push stuff out to the FSR and the ASR. Well, now we have the web tier repository, we have the file transfer receiver, and then we have transfer services that actually allow you to push content to these entities. Excuse me, one thing that I might mention, I've played around with the file system transfer receiver, and if I remember correctly, to transfer services, it does look like a repository. Obviously, it's not a full-on Alfresco repository, but they've kind of set it up so that so the transfer services actually can look at it and detect it and figure out what to do with it. Now, there are some differences between our web content services and our web content management offerings. And I'm going to highlight the differences here. So a lot of the things that we've already pushed into our web content services offering, I'm not going to talk about here. But some of the things that the AVM provides that have no equivalent in the core repository are sandboxes, multi-asset versioning, and snapshots and rollback. Okay? On the flip side, the core repository provides some things that were not available in the AVM. Support for rules, more sophisticated access control. I mean, if you remember in the AVM, you essentially had like 3 or 4 roles. If you look now in the core repository, you can create a number of different roles. And you might have a website that has many different segments and many different parts. And rather than having to struggle with saying, OK, I'm going to create 4 different web projects to push out, you can say, OK, well, I have this content. I have it in different share sites or whatever. And you can just manage the rules around content with that person. And they could be in share sites. They could be in non-share sites that are just in the repository where you've just created your own custom roles and things like that. But you have all of that flexibility. You have seamless support in the core repository. And you also have more complete functionality. So you have better APIs, search, workflow, modeling, and you've got a lot of metadata extraction and content transformation. So everything that we've built up in the core repository is now available to people managing content that's going to end up on the web. Now, what are the impact of some of the differences? Well, the web tier, the web content services web tier, has all the functionality that is available in a WCM web tier. You can push everything that you could push out in WCM. You can push things out similarly in the core repository. I think the last piece that was added was the file system transfer services. So once we were able to push out static content, we had dealt with a lot of the issues of, I need to get stuff to the web tier. How do I do it? You have additional expanded features in the core repository that I think should provide an improved user experience for your authors now. And I would argue that the features that we have opted not to move to the core repository are features that are really important to a small and shrinking set of use cases. And that goes back to my whole premise that the web of today is not the web of 2005. And to illustrate, I think that if you look at multiple, and we'll talk about the differences. So if I look at the characteristics of sites that the AVM was designed for, I look at these sites as sites that are developed and deployed as a unit. This goes back to the whole notion of you have the webmaster who's doing something in Dreamweaver. They're creating all of the CSS files. They're creating the navigation. I remember before looking at PHP and Perl when it was just HTML, you might have to, each page, you might have to say, okay, oh, this page, I have to manually highlight the fact that this page is selected. I mean, there were a number of things that you did as a web developer where everything had to come together as a unit, and you would prepare the website, and then you would deploy that website out, and you'd take a snapshot. I think there's also, so that's one set of users. I think the other one is where you have page changes that might include a large number of assets. I mean, in reality, still today, you might have, even if you look at some things like Drupal and some of the other ones where you're dealing with pages, you might have a single page that is dependent on a number of images. But to a large extent, most of the content in your sites, they kind of live on their own. You might change one page and say, oh, I need to deploy it out now. You might change another page and say, okay, now that one is ready. And maybe there's a few assets that go along with it, but it's usually a manageable set. What you don't have, and I would also argue that this whole notion of, oh, I have to roll back my entire site is incongruent with how people usually work with sites now. I might edit a page that has a mistake on it and push it out at 12:05, and then Daryl might push out a perfectly valid page at 12:10. Now, in the old way, you say, oh, I've got to roll back the site to before when Richard posted his page so that we can fix the problem. Now you just say, look, we have to roll back Rich's content and not roll back all the content that was published afterwards. And then the other use case would be sites that deploy code and content together. I think that, and this is where I talked about the different teams. Now the AVM, because it does snapshots and everything, could be used in the same way that you might use SVN in your cutting releases. But at the end of the day, if you look at the teams that develop sites, the content creators are going to want to create content in something that has a WYSIWYG editor and do their thing. And then the people who are creating the CSS, the theming and everything, they generally are going to work in a separate, they're going to have a separate work stream. And quite honestly, they're better off putting things in ClearCase, Subversion, Git, or whatever, because they really do have a release, and it's software that they're releasing to a large extent. And you might say, well, the theming, which is CSS and images and things like that, that's in a gray area. I kind of call that code. And and those are things that are sets of things that go together. And you can argue that even the content, I can change the theme of the site, I can change a lot of things. The content doesn't have to change at this point. And so you might have, you really have two worlds running together. They might do testing to say, okay, now that we have this new theme, does it work with all our content? But it is two separate worlds at this point. Now, if you're one of the clients, the customers that say, well, I have one of these scenarios, I think this is a good point in the process to look at it and say, what do I need to do for a path forward? So I think customers who have this situation, they're the ones who might have the biggest struggle. But I do think that there is a way forward. You just have to review the process and figure out what's the best way to move forward. Some of the characteristics of more of the emerging use cases. So we have content items, as I said before, they have fewer interdependencies. Each piece of content, if you look at sites where we have a bunch of press releases, we have a bunch of these things. Each piece of content really lives on its own. And pages that are generated that aggregate the content, they're generated dynamically. So they really live in software. And so your content really is more discrete pieces. Content on the same site might come from different sources. So you may have some content that's coming where people are actually editing it. You may have other bits of content that are being imported in through some other process. You have content that's targeted to multiple sources. So you might have, so I may create content, and it may show up on more than one site. It may show up in a catalog site. It may show up in some other spec where I have a discussion about it. And then you have content that appears on the web, and it may be a small part of a larger life cycle. So a lot of times, as a content creator, I might not even know I'm creating content for. I might not think of it in terms of I'm creating content for the web. I might be creating specs on a product or something like that. That content may end up in a catalog. It may end up in other places. And oh, by the way, we have to make it available on the web. So the web is not necessarily the central focus a lot of times with the content we have, even when we are using web content services. But these characteristics, the emerging use cases, I would argue do not require the features that we've deprecated in the AVM. So the question is there life after the AVM? Will I be able to survive? And the answer is yes, but life isn't always easy. Projects with a heavy dependency on the AVM will need to be re-engineered, re-architected, and undergo a process change. But projects that naturally lend themselves to web content services still probably need to consider some level of renovation. And I do believe that the move is in the right direction. I truly believe that the end result will be that there will be a lot of benefits, but those benefits don't come for free. And I think we all realize that. So there are going to be some technical issues that you deal with. The content modeling is going to be slightly different. The user interface uses a completely different framework. And your deployment tools are different. So even though we go from having the FSR and the ASR to using web transfer services, we have a different interface framework. And just to go through this, so the old web forms defined the user interface and the content model together in one unit. So when in the old AVM, when I was doing web forms, I had an XSD schema, and that's how I defined my content types. And really, I wasn't defining necessarily a proper content type. I was defining a schema to create an XML file. The file that piece of content went into Alfresco as an XML file. And then, if I needed to use some of the metadata, I still had to go into the regular content modeling and create some aspects that could, be applied, when you use metadata extraction. So I still had to go and create a content model for the core repository. The constraint validation in the AVM was done at the UI layer and was not done in the repository. So you weren't creating constraints that were being evaluated when you committed the content. It was dependent on your web form itself. And that made it very difficult to validate ingested content and things like that. So the way that the web form was developed and everything, it was a lighter weight approach. It was similar to the way many lightweight CMSs approach things. You quickly create a type, configure it to look the way you need it to, and then you could go to work. It was a low entry for threshold, but it was inflexible to go beyond what it was initially designed for. And so I think that was the problem with the old web forms. And just to give an example, here's an example content model. Most of the things we have a couple of strings, a date, a Boolean, and then we have this complex type. So this is a typical web form. Now, just to give you an idea, just about everything in this web form can be modeled in DM, though this part in orange is going to be a little challenging, and let's talk a little bit about it. So cardinality can be handled with required and multiple. Okay, so if you say, look, I have 0 to 1, I have 0 to many, I have, one or many, that's fine. What might not be as easy to do is to handle it where you say, look, I have a minimum of 0 items, and a maximum of 10. Maybe you have to use a custom constraint to do that, but it's something that's doable, and you could probably come up with a set of custom constraints to handle some of those cardinality rules. The inter-content relationships could be handled with node refs or relationships, depending on whether you needed to version those relationships between content. Complex metadata types could be an issue. And there's a few ways to handle it. I mean, you could bundle the value in a serialized version of a content property. You could possibly have parallel multi-valued properties, but then you might need some kind of a constraint to make sure that if they were supposed to be parallel, you didn't have 5 in one slot and 4 in the other slot. You could use child objects. So rather than making it one piece of content, you create this content, have a special kind of child relationship, and just add those other bundles as child objects. Maybe, maybe not as, maybe you don't use the CM contains because maybe your piece of content is not a folder, but maybe you create another parent-child relationship that's just like, composite object, child, and do that. Or you could alter the data dictionary to support proper composite properties. That's quite ambitious. I wouldn't try it, without making it a community project and getting a lot of people involved. I mean, because it would involve things like how do you handle search and a lot of other things. So that would be probably a real ambitious one. I've talked about it with a couple of people in the past and came to the conclusion it was tough. What we do get, though, at the end of the day, is a unified modeling scheme for all content. XSD was not designed to do content modeling. And we have a content model language that is tailored to the repository. Whether you like it or not, whether it's perfect or not, we've got it, it works, and anybody who's worked with Alfresco understands it. Now, so we've talked about the whole content model transformation, what we need to do. Then there's the other issue of the XSD to the Forms SDK. I'll just say this. Both the web forms XSD and the share-based forms have the ability to pick reasonable UI components for each property type. So I don't think you're going to have a big problem there. Both of them have out-of-the-box widgets, and both of them allow for custom widgets. Now, the web forms use Dojo. The Forms SDK uses more UI components. all that. I don't think that, I think that you will be able to migrate if you plan it right, if you allocate the right resources for it. And just think of it not just in terms of, oh, we have to do this migration, but what are the opportunities for it? So some of the conclusions. Moving will be necessary at some point. It's going to happen. You've got probably 18 to 24 months to think about it and prepare about it. So it shouldn't catch anybody by surprise. And I know from a messaging standpoint, I'm sure we'll be jumping up and down and telling everybody you've got to do this. I think in general there's a lot to gain from the process. And I think that you can leverage that. And especially if you have to justify the cost, maybe it's not just we've got to change this, but maybe we can improve processes. It's non-trivial. Don't think it's just going to be, we flip a switch and do it. I wouldn't tell you that. And be prepared to commit the proper resources to it. And if you do all that, I think that 2 years from now when we're at DevCon 2014, we'll have some conversations that'll be positive ones. At least I hope so. That's all for my talk. Any questions? No questions, no barbs, no. All right, well, thank you for your time.